So today I want to talk a little bit about the comparisons between 2004's film I, Robot and then the Isaac Asimov short stories compiled in I, Robot. So, sort of an introduction, the movie I, Robot was made in 2004 and directed by Jeff Vinter. Um, the author Isaac Asimov is an American science fiction author, and he sort of created I, Robot as a collection of sci-fi short stories. So the story of the movie, it started out sort of that Fox had acquired the rights to Asimov's short stories, and at the time they had a script for sort of like a robot action movie that was written in the 90s. So in sort of the late 90s, early 2000s, they sort of merged those two together. Originally, it was going to follow Asimov's stories and the three laws of robotics really, really carefully and being sort of a love letter to the stories. However, Hollywood brought on Will Smith, and it was decided that it was going to become an action movie. Now, something to kind of consider too is sort of the cultural differences between the eras these two pieces were made. So in Asimov's time, it's the 60s, it's sort of that mid-century era where technology is kind of going crazy. People are really excited about all the new advances and innovations, but a lot of people are feeling some skepticism. There's also sort of that threat of communism hanging over people where there's a lot of distrust, there's a lot of fear of almost that idea of like a takeover or being sort of like dangerous people among a group. And then whereas the film, it reflects more of like a post 9/11 atmosphere with there being a lot of paranoia. The character of Del Spooner in the film is really distrustful of technology. He really rejects it. He seems very cynical, very jaded. There's even sort of a moment in the film where the robot Vicky believes she's responsible for protecting all of humanity. And quote from the movie, she says, "Some humans must be sacrificed to ensure your future. Some freedoms must be surrendered." Now, this is really reminiscent sort of that Patriot Act sort of idea of people giving up their privacy, giving up a lot of their personal freedoms for what was sort of called the greater good, whether or not sort of that's what came about. Sort of a comparison as well. In a lot of Asimov's stories, the protagonists are typically defined by their cleverness. Many of the robot stories are presented as puzzles for the reader to kind of figure out as they go. Whereas the film sort of does away with a lot of that. Kind of an example would be Asimov has a short story in iRobot called Little Lost Robot, in which there's 63 identical robots. There was a slight programming adjustment to one of them. And one of the sort of workers told a robot to get lost. So it gets lost in this big crowd of robots just around the time they're trying to now figure out which of these robots has the programming error. And the character Susan Calvin then designs a series of tests to reveal which robot has the malfunction. And it sort of goes on and on. There's a series of tests that sort of break down and try and, through a process of elimination, through the laws of robotics, kind of figure out which robot is the outlier, which becomes more and more difficult. And while I mention that, I will go through the three laws of robotics as laid out by Asimov. First law being a robot may not injure a human being or through any inaction allow a human being to come to harm. Second, must obey orders given by its humans except where such orders would conflict with the first law. And the third law is the robot must try to preserve itself as long as such protection does not conflict with the first or second law. So this kind of does come into play as well in the film. Del Spooner, there's sort of this subtext that he distrusts robots so much because when he was in a dangerous situation, a robot chose to save his life instead of the life of a child. And he believed that that was the wrong decision. The robot's rationale was that it would be more successful to save Del than it would the child, so it did choose Del. And that sort of comes into play with Little Lost Robot. That's one of the tests that Susan Calvin sort of puts upon that robot, where they simulate a human coming to harm when there's sort of like an electric fence between them. So the robots would die if they tried to protect the human, and to her surprise, none of the robots go through. And this is sort of shocking because normally the programming would mean that they would save the human no matter what. But the misprogrammed robot has now spoken to the rest of them, which is interesting. Asimov also speaks of what he calls the Frankenstein complex, in which stories about robots sort of reflect people's fear that robots will rise up and dominate them. And I think that's definitely a sentiment you could also kind of relate to that post 9/11 kind of, again, fear and paranoia that people had of the other. It's the same fear of the other that people were having, in the 50s and 60s with Russia and the Cold War. So it's kind of interesting, even though there are a lot of differences, sort of between these two works. I think they both still reflect the deep anxieties people have of invasion, of other, of technology. It's just sort of in a different context. So it's kind of interesting to sort of delve into those two stories. And yeah, my sources will be just at the end of the video. And thank you for listening.